There is a carriage in a museum in South Bend, Indiana. It is black and low-slung, with a collapsible leather hood and solid silver lamps. On the evening of the 14th of April, 1865, Abraham Lincoln rode in it to Ford's Theater. It is one of the most significant objects in American history, and it sits in a building named after a car company. And almost every time it is mentioned, it is called a Studebaker. It is not one. It was built in 1864 by Wood Brothers of New York. What Studebaker did was buy it. After the assassination, Lincoln's son sold his father's carriage, and Clement Studebaker, one of the founding brothers, bought it and brought it home to Indiana, which tells you something about this company. By the end, American transportation was so bound up with the Studebaker name that even the things it never built ended up belonging to it. And the real version is almost as good as the myth. Studebaker did build carriages for presidents. The same museum holds the one it made for Benjamin Harrison. In 1865, it was already one of the largest wagon builders in the United States, and within 20 years, it would be the largest wagon and carriage manufacturer in the world, at the top of a global industry before the automobile had been invented. It was founded in 1852, 13 years before Lincoln died, by two brothers with two forges and $68. It is the only American wagon maker that survived the automobile. Every one of the others is gone. It lasted 114 years, and on the 9th of December, 1963, 16 days before Christmas, the city it had built found out that it was closing, from a newspaper. Before this is over, a wheelbarrow business in the California gold rush. Trucks so common on the Eastern Front that Red Army drivers had their own name for them. A president who kept paying shareholders out of a till that was emptying. One of the most beautiful cars America ever built, ruined not by the design, but by a decision inside the factory. A merger that failed to save either company and finished both. And a pension collapse so severe that Congress wrote a law about it, a law that still sits behind every private pension in America. This is the story of December 1963, but it begins in 1852 in a blacksmith shop with $68. This is BrandTale Saga, where we take apart the companies that built the cars, down to the factory floor and the people who bet everything on it. If that's your kind of story, subscribe. The collapse here is every bit as strange as the rise. In February 1852, Henry and Clement Studebaker open a blacksmith shop in South Bend, Indiana. They have two forges and $68 between them. In their first year, they build two wagons. Their family has been making wagons in America since the 1730s. It is not an ambitious business. It is a trade practiced competently in a small town. What changes it is the third brother. John Moeller Studebaker goes to California in 1853 in the gold rush and does not mine. He arrives in a camp called Hangtown, is asked whether he can make wheelbarrows, says yes, and spends 5 years building them for men digging for gold. They call him Wheelbarrow Johnny. It is the least dramatic decision anyone made in the gold rush, and one of the very few that worked. He comes home in 1858 with the better part of $8,000 and buys a share of his brother's business. But look at whose share he buys. He buys Henry's, because by 1858, the shop is not just serving farmers. It is filling an order for the United States Army. Hundreds of wagons, 4 years before the Civil War starts. And the Studebakers are Dunkards, a sect that holds that war is evil. The official company history says only that Henry was tired and wanted to farm. Other accounts say he could not square army contracts with what he believed. Either way, the man whose initial is the H&H and C. Studebaker takes his money, walks out to a farm, and misses everything that follows. 3 years later, the country goes to war. The Union Army needs wagons in numbers nobody has ever ordered before, built to a standard, repairable by a mechanic in a field. Studebaker delivers thousands of them, supply wagons, ambulances, gun caissons. and learns the thing it never forgets: how to build the same object correctly tens of thousands of times. Through the 1870s and 1880s, the company grows to a scale that is hard to picture now because the product is invisible to us. Farm wagons, freight wagons, carriages, buggies, the infrastructure of a country that moves everything by horse, 6,000 vehicles a year by 1867, more than 75,000 by 1885. At the height of the westward migration, roughly half the wagons on the trails are Studebakers. It becomes the largest manufacturer of horse-drawn vehicles in the world, not in America, in the world. Twice the plant burns to the ground, twice they rebuild it bigger. The second fire in 1874 lands in the same year. Sales pass $1 million for the first time, which tells you something about how fast this business was moving. The five brothers grow wealthy and prominent and pour the money back into South Bend: churches, schools, parks. Clement builds himself a 40-room mansion in the middle of town, and it is still standing. This is the part that matters most later. Studebaker does not simply employ South Bend, it builds it. The company and the city grow into each other until there is no meaningful line between them. Then, in the 1890s, the automobile arrives. For a wagon manufacturer, this is a death sentence, and almost every one of them treats it as such by ignoring it. There are thousands of carriage and wagon builders in America in 1900. Essentially, none of them exist today. Studebaker moves, cautiously at first, and then completely. An electric car in 1902, petrol cars from 1904, built in partnership with other firms, cars under Studebaker's own name from 1913. And in 1920, it builds its last horse-drawn wagon and closes that side of the business for good after 68 years. No other American wagon maker managed that, not one. They saw it coming and they moved in time. Which makes what happens next harder to explain, not easier. Because the thing that eventually killed Studebaker was not a failure to see the future. Through the 1920s, Studebaker is solid, profitable, and independent. Not Ford or General Motors, but real and respected. Its president is Albert Erskine, and Erskine believes in confidence. He believes a strong company pays its shareholders well and is seen to pay them well, and that the appearance of strength produces the reality of it. So when the Depression arrives and Studebaker's sales collapse, as everyone's sales collapse, Erskine does not cut the dividend. In 1930, he pays out $7.8 million, far more than the company earns. In 1931, he pays out $3.5 million more, and by then it is coming straight out of capital. There is a version of this that sounds like fraud. I don't think it was. I think it was a man applying the only playbook he had to a situation it did not fit, and a board that watched him do it and said nothing. He also makes a mistake that only makes sense in a company town. He names a budget car after Knut Rockne, the Notre Dame football coach, a man Studebaker had been paying to speak at dealer events, killed in a plane crash in 1931. Erskine puts the town's saint on a car. It fails. What finally breaks the company is not sales. In 1932, with the cash almost gone, Studebaker tries to buy the White Motor Company. Minority shareholders at White block the deal. Studebaker runs out of money. In March 1933, it goes into receivership. Albert Erskine is forced out. On the 1st of July 1933, he takes his own life. Two of its own executives, Paul Hoffman and Harold Vance, reorganize the company and bring it out of receivership in 1935. They do a genuinely impressive job, but the balance sheet never recovers. From 1933 onward, Studebaker operates with less cushion than its competitors, and every decision after that is made under that constraint. And then in 1938, 5 years after nearly going under, Studebaker does something that tells you exactly what kind of company it still believes it is. At its proving grounds west of South Bend, with a crew from the Civilian Conservation Corps, it plants 8,000 pine seedlings in the shape of its own name. Letters 250 feet tall, more than 2,000 feet end to end, legible only from the air, aimed at passengers on aeroplanes passing overhead. The letters of the Hollywood sign are 50 feet. Then the war arrives, and for a few years none of it matters. Studebaker's Second World War is enormous. It builds the US-6 military truck, nearly 200,000 of them, about half with six-wheel drive. Roughly 90% go abroad under Lend-Lease, and around 150,000 end up with the Red Army, hauling ammunition and towing guns across the Eastern Front. Soviet drivers call them Studers. Men who never saw Indiana said the name every day. It also builds aircraft engines for the B-17. South Bend is booming, and then Studebaker does the smartest thing it ever did, partly by accident. American manufacturers were barred from working on post-war car designs during the war. But Studebaker's design work was done by Raymond Loewy Associates, an outside contractor, which was not covered by the restriction. While Detroit was legally frozen, Studebaker's designers kept working. On the 30th of April 1946, Studebaker unveiled its 1947 models, clean, low, modern, with a wraparound rear window. The first genuinely new post-war car from a major American manufacturer, roughly 2 years ahead of the Big Three, who were still selling facelifted 1942 shapes. The slogan was, accurately, that Studebaker was first by far with a post-war car. The design is credited to Loewy. The truth is better. The car management chose was developed in secret by Virgil Exner, Loewy's own lead stylist in South Bend, fed engineering data by Studebaker's own chief engineer that was deliberately withheld from Loewy's official team. When the advertising went out crediting Loewy, Loewy fired Exner for it and replaced him with his deputy, Bob Bourke. Remember that name. 1950 is the peak. Record profit, 250,000 cars, roughly 4% of the American market, 25,000 people on the payroll. Then, in 1953, Bob Bourke produces the Starliner coupe, a car regularly named among the most beautiful ever built in America. And Studebaker turns it into a catastrophe. The company expected the sedans to sell and the coupe to be a halo car, and tooled the factory accordingly. The public wanted the coupe. Studebaker could not build them fast enough, could not sell the sedans it had prepared for, and spent the model year missing demand in both directions. That was a bad year. Companies survive bad years. Studebaker had 10 years left. What made this one fatal was where it happened. Studebaker's labor costs per car were higher than any rivals in the American industry. Its South Bend workforce was among the best paid in the country, working under agreements accumulated across decades in a town where the company and the community were the same thing. And that is not a story about greed on anyone's side. It is what happens when a firm spends a century as a town's patron. Studebaker's management were South Bend men. Their workers were their neighbors. Concessions a Detroit corporation would have fought were granted here, because refusing them meant something socially and not just commercially. In 1954, Studebaker merged with Packard. On paper, it was two proud independents combining against the Big Three. In practice, Packard had not audited the books. Their finance chief went through the numbers afterwards and worked out that Studebaker's real break-even was around 282,000 cars a year, a figure it had reached exactly once, in 1950. They had bought a company that could not make money at almost any volume it was capable of producing. The merger failed to save either of them and finished both. Packard's Detroit production ended within 2 years. By 1958, the name was gone. The last cars to wear it were rebadged Studebakers, an undignified end for a marque that had once outsold Cadillac. And in 1958, quietly, Studebaker-Packard terminated the pension plan covering Packard's hourly workers in Detroit. Thousands of men found out the money they had been promised was not there. Almost nobody outside Detroit noticed. Remember that too. By then, Studebaker was surviving on something that wasn't a Studebaker at all. In 1957, it had taken on distribution of Mercedes-Benz in the United States, selling German cars through American dealers for a fee. The car company was being kept alive by selling somebody else's cars. And then, improbably, it works one more time. In 1959, Studebaker launches the Lark. Compact, sensibly priced, built largely from existing tooling, aimed at a market the Big Three had ignored entirely. It sells 131,000, and the company turns a profit for the first time since the merger with Packard. 1960 is strong too. For 2 years, Studebaker looks like a company with a future. It lasts exactly as long as it takes Detroit to notice. Ford, Chevrolet, and Chrysler all launch compacts as 1960 models. Studebaker's advantage was never the product, it was being alone in the segment. By 1961, the Lark is under 65,000. And here the story turns on something most tellings leave out. The president who greenlit the Lark was Harold Churchill. He wanted to stay in the car business. The board did not. It wanted to take the profits and buy other companies. In the autumn of 1960, it removed him for disagreeing. The man who had just saved the company was fired for wanting to keep building cars. The board bought generators, floor machines, small tractors, and an oil additive company called STP. Then it hired a president from a chainsaw manufacturer to finish the job, Sherwood Egbert. Egbert had other ideas. He spent the money on cars. The best of them was the Avanti, a fiberglass coupe designed by Loewy's team in a rented house in Palm Springs in around 40 days, unlike anything else on sale. It should have been a sensation, but the bodies came from an outside supplier. The panels didn't fit, production slipped by months, and buyers who had put money down cancelled and bought Corvettes. Around 4,500 were built. Meanwhile, the businesses the board had bought were quietly, reliably profitable. By 1963, the Studebaker Corporation contained a healthy industrial group and one loss-making car division in Indiana. Egbert was fighting cancer. On the 22nd of November 1963, in the day Kennedy was shot in Dallas, the board replaced him with a finance man named Byers Burlingame. And the question the board had been circling for 3 years stopped being about how to save the car division. It became whether there should be one at all. Studebaker's own workers found out from the newspaper. On the afternoon of Monday the 9th of December 1963, the South Bend Tribune ran a front-page banner, "Auto output to end here." A reporter had the story before the company told anyone in Indiana. Carriers took copies to Gate 1, where the shift was coming off at 3:30. Officials confirmed it that afternoon from New York. In the Tribune's photograph of the men leaving Gate 1 that day, the flag above them is at half-mast. It had been lowered for Kennedy 17 days earlier and not yet raised. The board chairman told reporters they were being bled to death. About 7,000 people lost their jobs, 8% of the entire area workforce, in a city of 130,000, 16 days before Christmas. 13 years earlier, that payroll had been over 22,000. The final South Bend car was built on the 20th of December. I want to be careful about the villain here because there is a version told as pure corporate treachery, and I don't think it survives contact with the accounts. The car division had lost money for most of a decade, and it was consuming the businesses that were profitable. Keeping South Bend open would have destroyed the whole company rather than part of it, but the reason it lands the way it does is that Studebaker was not an employer in South Bend. It was the reason South Bend existed at that scale. It had built the churches and the parks. 3 generations of the same families had worked there. Unemployment went from 2% to 9% in weeks. And here is the part that surprises people. The labor market recovered fast, other manufacturers moved into the empty buildings, and by late 1965, unemployment was back under 3%. What never came back was the city itself. South Bend's population began falling and kept falling for decades. Production limped on in Ontario for 2 more years, building Studebakers with engines bought from Chevrolet, which tells you everything about what was left. On the 17th of March, 1966, the last Studebaker was built in Hamilton. But for several thousand men in Indiana, losing the job was not the last thing this company did to them. Studebaker's pension plan was underfunded. When the plant closed, the company terminated it, and there was not enough money in it to pay what had been promised. The plan covered about 10,500 workers. Around 3,600 had already retired. They got their pensions in full. About 4,000 more were between 40 and 59. Average age 52. Average time at the company 23 years. They received roughly 15 cents for every dollar they had been promised, and around 2,900 men, all with less than 10 years of service, received nothing at all. Not reduced, nothing. The company had followed the union contract to the letter. The contract said the money went first to the retired and the ready to retire, and it did. The New York Times wrote at the time that the fact this left thousands of men in their 40s and 50s with nothing was a calamity, but not a crime, and it had happened before. Studebaker-Packard had done the same thing to the Packard men in 1958, and those workers got even less. That is what made Studebaker the case that stuck. Not that it was unique, that it was the second time at a scale nobody could ignore, to a workforce whose union was prepared to make it a national argument. It ran through congressional hearings for a decade and sits throughout the legislative history of the Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974. ERISA set minimum funding standards for private pensions and created a federal corporation to ensure them. It was not written because of Studebaker alone, but Studebaker is the case everyone cites, and the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation still names it as the collapse that proved the protection was necessary. The company's last act was to demonstrate at their expense exactly why the law needed to exist. The Studebaker National Museum in South Bend is a good museum, and it is busy. It holds the wagons, the Avanti, the Loewy designs, and the carriage Abraham Lincoln rode to Ford's Theatre, which the company did not build and which people will go on calling a Studebaker anyway. 114 years after 2 brothers bought 2 forges, there is something fitting in that. But the thing I keep coming back to is the trees. They are still there west of the city, on what used to be the proving grounds. Studebaker is gone. Bendix bought the land, then Bosch, then Navistar. The letters have thinned badly. An ice storm in 2004 took thousands of the pines, and volunteers now raise money to replant them. But fly over northern Indiana today, and you can still read it, 250 feet tall, planted in the middle of the Depression by a company that had just watched itself almost die, and decided to write its own name across the landscape anyway. The company that built a town and could not save it and is still legible from the sky. So, where was the real turning point? Was it 1933, when the company came out of receivership permanently short of the cushion its competitors had, or 1954, and a merger that failed to save either company and finished both? Tell me in the comments. My own answer changed while I was researching this one. And if you want the other side of this, an American independent that wasn't squeezed out over 30 years but stopped almost before it started, watch the Tucker story next.